Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Citizen on the Record. This time we are going to be discussing the Ukraine-Russia war, and we have two eminent personalities and experts with us. There is Ambassador M.K Bhadrakumar, who is retired IFS officer. He served as an ambassador and held many diplomatic roles, played many diplomatic roles, and is now a columnist and a writer who is tracking foreign policy very, very closely. And we have Professor Anuradha Chenoy. She's retired from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. She's the former Dean of International Studies, an expert on Russia, Central Asia, and international relations. So we are really happy to have you both with us. Let's discuss a little bit of the current situation. I mean, yesterday, I think America, which is playing a very major role, obviously, and is behind all that's happening in that region, Biden has used certain words which are not really considered very diplomatic when he said that this man should not remain in power. So I'll start with you, Ambassador Bhadrakumar. You've seen sort of use of words and phrases which show a certain kind of desperation, or what?
Actually, this particular incident in Poland,
yes,
is only one more example. You know, he has a loose tongue, and you know, he's 80 years old, and even some congressmen reacted there yesterday, saying that it will be advisable for our president to stick to the written drafts that are given to him and not to stray out from there, you know. So it's come out that this is not what the officials, bureaucrats in the National Security Council or White House wrote out for him, but then he went off on a tangent. You know, there is a strong rumor of Alzheimer and, you know, dementia and all that kind of thing. You know, it's been going around for some time, and there is even a talk that by the end of the year, he may probably step down and make way for Kamala Harris and a new team with old Hillary Clinton coming in as vice president to run the administration and so on. There's a very strong rumor on those lines. So you see, this was a stopgap arrangement to stop the momentum of Donald Trump, you know. So we have to look at it that way. I don't think that this is by any reckoning. Blinken, who was in Israel, said day before yesterday, upon his arrival, first thing he was asked was this, and he straight away said that this is not American policy, regime change in Russia, you know. So, because it is very serious consequences, you know. So Europeans, one after the other, Macron said, you know, that I would never say a thing like this. And German Chancellor Scholz said that regime change is not at all in the consideration zone for the Western Alliance. So you see, that this particular thing was a...
okay, fine.
Yeah. That's it.
Right. So Anuradha Chenoy, this whole thing, you know, about Russia and Putin becoming the big bad person in the Western media and also to an extent in the region is actually not, you know, I mean, it's sort of missing the bus in the sense that the role of NATO, the terrible wars that NATO has fought and engineered and participated in the region, the role of America in Afghanistan and in Iraq, Iran, well, Iran also under pressure. You know, all this has become we are sort of losing the focus. Do you think so?
I think actually it is their focus because they precisely do not want to mention NATO. Their constant refrain since the beginning of this war has been that do not use NATO to justify Russian position. That has been very central in the media and in the official discourse. So they want to focus on the demonization of one individual, and this came out in Biden's stray remark. But it is, I believe, part of their policy to cover up the crimes of NATO, to cover up the expansion of NATO. And in fact, I believe that NATO is actually in different ways moving to Eurasia for a long struggle. So NATO is central, but they don't want to show it. It is part of their grand strategy. Ultimately, if you see their strategic doctrines papers in the Congress and others, it's really that these are the new forever wars. The old forever wars of the Middle East, the war on terror is over, and now it is this great power competition, or GPS as they call it in the Washington diplomatic strategic groups. So the press is following that, and they're diverting their attention from NATO, from American militarization, from European remilitarization, and focusing on this demon, good versus evil, democracy versus authoritarianism. So it fits into their plan so that others cannot see beyond it. And it's matched by those horrible pictures. They are very heart-wrenching pictures on television of what war brings. So it's falling into place like a jigsaw.
So there is, Ambassador Bhadrakumar, a certain kind of polarization we are seeing around this war, which is of course being also played out in the public domain through the media and the social media, a kind of polarization between the West and this part of the world, polarization between the whites and the coloreds in terms of immigrants and others, and the refugees who try to cross the borders, and also a polarization and differences about the coverage of Russia and Ukraine, which is seen now as a satellite of the West. What would you say to that?
You see, Seema, I see that this is a multi-layered situation. NATO is undoubtedly one crucial aspect there. But then on the other hand, we also know that all major decisions of NATO and most minor decisions of NATO are invariably taken in Washington, and that Americans are in the driving seat, and the European allies who have to take, who have to have an umbrella, a security umbrella for themselves. Otherwise, it's exorbitantly expensive for them to have their own defense system. So the American protection is necessary, and they have no alternative but to travel along. Now, the best evidence of this is this, that already there is misgiving in the minds of a lot of these NATO allies in Europe about where this is all heading to. They clearly didn't bargain for it this way. So you look at it, from a perspective such as that, and then you will find that the American effort is also to rally the Europeans, because you see, it's a question of it's a vital question of transatlantic leadership of the United States, and maintaining that leadership is going to be very problematic. And I personally, my assessment is that while this is going on like this drama is unfolding like this, and there is so much of violence and conflict and polarization, as you put it, and so on, many of these allies are keeping quiet. But there is going to be a kind of an implosion within the Western system. And already you find this in the stray remarks. No, today let us see what Macron tells Putin. Macron has stepped out of line, that there is no polarization as far as Macron is concerned. And Macron has openly said it. Turkey, a very important NATO country, the second biggest military contingent in NATO next to the United States, it's refused to impose sanctions. Hungary, Orban said that there is no way that we can stop oil because we're getting 100% oil from Russia and at concessional rates, and we'll have to sit in darkness if we are to do that. And therefore, we cannot but constructively engage with Russia. And Orban has a wonderful personal relationship with Putin too. Bulgaria was the last country to step out. So now you see, you got, even in the alliance system, the so-called eastern flank bordering Ukraine, apart from Poland, the others have backed out. They don't allow Western military convoys to move through their territory towards Ukraine for supply of weapons. You know, what it entails in the practical in military terms, it's a very awkward situation there. NATO cannot intervene there. NATO countries cannot send arms supplies there because the Russians will incinerate them immediately upon their arrival because they are tracking that border, the Polish border. Mercenaries have started returning. In fact, last week, something like about 700 odd mercenaries left Ukraine. So the reverse flow has begun there. So it's a very awkward situation there for the United States to handle, because the assumption was that this sort of polarization, Putin will buckle under pressure, because you know, the Western understanding of Putin was also, despite his demonization and so on, the understanding of Putin also is that he genuinely sought a kind of the tongue with the West, which is true. In fact, time and again we see that, you know, that his interest was really to find habitation within a common European home for Russia. So they felt that with this kind of pressure on sanctions and so on, Russians would blink. That hasn't happened. Now the blowback has begun. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, that, you know, on the 23rd, Putin has announced that all energy trade with Russia on the part of the European countries, or the so-called unfriendly states, as they have labeled these people now, that has to be done in rubles. Now, imagine what does this entail? This makes a mockery of the sanctions system, the sanctions regime.
Right.
This means all these countries will have to deal with the same central bank that they have banned, the Russian central bank, to get rubles for making the payment. And yesterday, Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, announced that no ruble payment, no energy supply, nothing comes free. And today is the cutoff date, actually. So you see, already they are feeling this. And Scholz is saying that, you know, that we will have unemployment, we will have poverty, and we should be prepared for this. So there's no way we can stop, you know, doing business with Russia. So Germany is major power, you know. So you see, all these are playing out. I will come more on this subject later, but I'm just illustrating the point that it's just not NATO alone. You know, there is a transatlantic leadership. United States' strategy towards China. Importance of weakening Russia, therefore, is very important for the United States. Weakening Russia, clipping its wings so that China doesn't in its strategic depth. All these aspects are there. And then, you know, at the back of the mind, there has always been this agenda of the dismemberment of Russia, you know.
Right. I just want to take this forward with Professor Chenoy, since you know Russia so well. You know, there's been, again, in the media, continuous harping that he was caught by, President Putin was caught by surprise. He didn't really bargain for this. He didn't bargain for sanctions. He'd be destroyed economically. He didn't plan for this kind of a war. He thought he would threaten people and they would back off. I mean, it's obviously not playing out in that manner at all.
I think on the contrary, Russia has been preparing for this since 2008. Since the West first put sanctions on them when they intervened in Georgia over North and South Ossetia. These were two provinces which wanted to combine because they had been artificially divided, and with the fall of the Soviet Union, they found themselves in two different countries. So Russia decided to support them, intervened in the internal situation, which was very shaky in Georgia. And of course, the West didn't stop that Russian intervention, but they did put sanctions. Then till 2014, the Russians were watching very closely as to what was happening in Ukraine vis-a-vis Crimea and the Donbass region, where American advisors had already started coming in. So they've been planning this, I think, very systematically since 2013. When in 2013, the same people of the State Department who were there advising in that Maidan, the coup against the Ukrainian leadership at that time, and brought in the right-wing leadership, the same people are now advising Biden in the Hill. So Putin has been, and Russia, the deep state in Russia has been watching this. They are prepared. They have prepared for sanctions. They have been talking about bypassing the hegemony of the dollar since years with China. If you see the minutes of the Asian, the new Asian banks, the new development bank, etc. There, even M.V. Kamath said at one point, and I have the quote somewhere, where he said, this oppression of the dollar we have to somewhat bypass. Of course, it doesn't mean that it's totally gone, but they have been systematically preparing, and they have set up a SWIFT system. It's not as big as a major Western SWIFT system, which has like 17,000 institutions linked to it. But this has enough in China, Europe, Venezuela. Now they're doing it with the UCO Bank in India, with Cuba, Iran. So after all, the S-400s in India were already paid for, I believe, by rubles or by rupees. And they have a history of, rupee-ruble trade. There were flaws in it, but it can be improved. So the Russians have been prepared. They have several plans. They didn't just have one plan. They knew they would be sanctioned. They knew there would be a weaponization of Ukraine. And their demands remain the same, which were there, I believe, before the war. Their two main demands are: one, neutrality for Ukraine; two, the eastern part of Ukraine should either be a demilitarized zone or some kind of buffer between them and NATO. And I think that's what they'll stand for. And until they get that, they will not go back. But I'd love to hear Ambassador's views on that. That's kind of what I'm reading into their primary literature. Yeah. So
would you agree with Professor Chenoy on this?
Yeah, broadly, I go along with that. You know, the Russian sincerity in engaging with the US in a dialogue is not to be doubted. You know, they might have made the preparations. They certainly would have made the preparations. But they were pinning hopes that, the Russians were pinning hopes that when the crunch time comes, there is still scope for working out a deal, you know, which is basically Russians needed a neutral Ukraine. Now, this is also a very major decision for Russia, because this means that Ukraine will not be part of the Eurasian Economic Union, the CIS system, and so on. It will be out of it. It will also have a relationship with the European Union, and it will only, as time passes, will drift closer and closer to the West. You know, maybe 2-3 generations later, there may be a different paradigm there altogether. But the Russians are willing for that, because the security concerns were quite genuine, you know, because Putin has repeatedly pointed this out, that this city where these Indian students were there, Kharkiv, if a missile system is placed there, it is within, Moscow is within, and St. Petersburg are within 5 minutes of an attack, a launch from there, which means it will be almost neutralizing Russia's second strike capability. There won't be any time even for the Russians to react. So Putin actually said in his speech when he announced the operation, he said, this is like a knife at our throat. You know, this is the expression he used. And he said earlier also, he said that, you know, there's no way for us we can compromise, because there is no space behind us. We are with our back against the wall. So, you know, the security considerations were quite valid. And this, in fact, takes us back to the American motives. You know, the American, personally, my own assessment is that they have had an agenda all through, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, an agenda towards Russia that they fulfilled brilliantly in Yugoslavia, in a very crude way, with a lot of violence and so on and so forth. But in Russia, you know, they, during Chechnya, for example, now details have come out, Putin himself has divulged the archival materials about this whole thing having been hatched by the CIA, both the wars in Chechnya. So you see, why did they do that? They did that when Yeltsin was around, and Yeltsin was having a circle of American advisors, and they were all, very, very pro-Western. Yeltsin's re-election was managed by an American company. The Americans spent money on it. All these things taken into account. Why did they still do that? So the point is this, that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans never believed that this was the end of the story, this is the end of history, And remember that, the first discussions relating to the NATO expansion began already by 1993, immediately after Bill Clinton came to power, And the villain of the piece is actually Stroop Talbott, Stroop Talbott was the point person in the Clinton administration for Yeltsin's Russia, So this agenda, therefore, I believe the Russians have written about it, and I don't think it is propaganda. I think it is genuinely, and Putin himself has said it, that we know what their intentions towards us are. So you see, it's not just a question of Donbass or anything like that. And then they said that if we don't have a dialogue like this,
right,
believe me, that we will find a way to fulfill our objectives there in Ukraine. And that's what they've done,
So back a little bit again to what you said earlier, Professor Chenoy, and also a little on the media, when you spoke of course, the oppression of the dollar, and they want to finish that, which is obviously also a statement, but also a euphemism in a way of the oppression of the Americans in various parts of this region. So in this war that we are seeing, a lot of it is, of course, it's physical between Ukraine and Russia, but then there is the perception war and the propaganda war being fought around it, in which the Americans versus the Russians, where do you see that today? Do you feel that the Russians have gained some ground after a not very happy start in the perception war?
Well, look, it's very difficult for because Russia started the aggression, the war, it's not easy. And Americans are wonderfully versed in soft power. No country can match them by a great distance. Their films, the number of channels, and the number of, it's a giant compared to the counter propaganda which can take place. For example, even take what they're saying about India. They're saying the Indian position is shaky, and every Western leader, even the Irish president, has said Indian position is unacceptable. So all of them echo this, and it echoes and it re-echoes and it trickles down to the population, to the people, etc. And the images on TV, and you can see that they have banned any Russian media. Europe has banned RT television. Now, if they're such a free media society, why did they feel they had to ban RT? Even people don't even want to drink vodka. Their sports is cancelled. So it's a form of propaganda, and you can see it's kind of, I think Putin was right when he said there's a cancel culture going on about Russia's culture. So their propaganda, however, is very sophisticated, whereas the Chinese and Russian and other propaganda, or their point of view also, they do not want that point of view to come across. And a large part of the world faces a similar kind of challenge. You can compare it with other films and other kind of propaganda. And I agree with Ambassador Bhadrakumar on what he is saying about the long, grand strategy of the US to crush Russia. And for 2 decades, Russia has been extending an hand of friendship, compromise, at least some dialogue, partnership for peace with the EU, with NATO, but it has been humiliatingly rejected. So in terms of real politics, that is the situation. And I think Putin and his Security Council, and he had backing in the Duma, etc., which have all kind of said that that old policy is not working because the Americans do want to crush Russia irreversibly. Thanks.
Right. So, on India, since Professor Chenoy has also raised it, India's position was not totally expected, at least for many of those who had been following it and its proximity to Washington, etc. So what do you make of it, Ambassador Bhadrakumar, as to one, why did we take this position in the UNSC and the UNGA? And also, are we going to be able to sustain it? Because we've come and are coming under a lot of pressure from America.
Well, there's the second part, I'd like to come to first, whether this is sustainable or not. That will clearly depend on the outcome of this struggle. This is a titanic struggle, an epochal struggle, really, that is unfolded there in Ukraine. And, how this turns out, nobody can tell. Russians are not going to lose, in my assessment, my own assessment. And I think their strategy, what I'm trying to say is, let me say at the beginning, that I think, we are again having a situation here where the Indian establishment is much ahead of, the discourses taking place in the media and so on, and true to their character, they don't try to, educate the public opinion. They think, that they can handle this on themselves, and they're going on a journey like that. So there is no misconception here that this will, if Russia loses, India loses, in the sense that it's been a pillar of strength for India. And also it's a very important factor in multipolarity. And in the absence of that, we have seen, for example, it's not a small thing that, when dollar was made the world currency, the assurance was given that dollar will be freely accessible for all countries in the world. And now, they have just frozen, the central bank reserves, foreign exchange reserves. So you see, this is a very, very serious situation. We are not going to look at this simply in terms of national sovereignty, self-determination, and so on. These are, of academic interest, really speaking, for a policymaker. He will have to think about other things, like, for example, if Russia gets crushed, then what about the Indian armed forces? They're standing today, is such the critical dependence on Russia. And then the fact of the matter is that it is Russia which supplies us, which provides us with access to such cutting-edge military technology. How do we figure in this club of 4 countries, in the world, which operate nuclear submarines? We didn't build it. We are taking on lease. And now, basically, we are not building it. We are not having it because NPT and all those things come in. So, Russians cannot sell it to us, but Russians are providing us with this for the last 15 or 20 years on lease continuously. So you see, this is the kind of willingness on the part of this partner for India, which even the United States does not even have this sort of an attitude towards its closest NATO allies. This is the reality. They don't part with their military technology of this kind of grade, high grade. So you see, it's the establishment, Indian establishment, I think for the policymaker, very, very big question. There's a very big question about this, the outcome of this struggle. And India has taken difficult decisions in the past when it was a much weaker country. And having been in the bureaucracy, I can tell you that we can hunker down, when it comes to that. And I think the visit by the Russian foreign minister shows that if it is due this week, shows that very serious discussions are taking place at multiple levels, national security level, economic ministers,
Right.
and so on. So, you know, the Americans, I don't think, are in a position to hustle us into anything else. So I think that this policy decision, which has been taken after 5 meetings, as if I'm not wrong, you know, 5 meetings at the level of the Prime Minister, which we haven't seen on any issue like this in rapid succession.
Right.
Decisions that have been taken are decisions that we intend to stick to. To answer the question, that's my assessment.
Okay. So final question to you, Professor Chenoy. This is a war that everybody expected at one stage to have escalated. There was talk of Third World War. Now you find that it is sort of a war between Russia and the Ukraine, and it is spreading very calculatedly, military installations, targeted government buildings, etc., etc. But at the same time, peace talks, attempts at peace have also been going on, and there's another fresh round beginning. So how do you see this panning out? Do you think it'll remain a war without sufficient escalation to make it a Third World War, or is this going to sort of peter out, or are we still in the danger zone?
Well, look, number one, I think we have to characterize this as something of a proxy war also, a war between Russia and the US-led NATO, where Ukraine, sadly, is what they are calling collateral damage. It's very heavy and sad damage to Ukraine. That's one. Second, I believe there are parties which are interested in a long war, that Russia remains occupied in this war for a long time, similar to, you know, Afghanistan or Vietnam before, where these asymmetric wars can actually take a long time. And that is the reason why countries like even Ukraine, Israel and Turkey are interested in the peace. They don't want a regional war. The Americans are they're the beneficiaries of this long war, but not the Europeans, and they want a quick peace. But the Russians have gone so far that they cannot withdraw without getting some terms of, you know, what they want, of disengagement. So I believe there shouldn't be a humiliating end either for Ukraine or Russia. A proper peace is important. And maybe they'll work out. I don't know how it will conclude, but I think Russia is prepared for this long war. Of course, all of us thought that it would be a quick victory. Maybe even the Russians thought that, given the asymmetry in forces. But the weaponization of Ukraine, the kind of support that they have been given, which can peter out, but the Americans, I think, are quite hell-bent on, you know, giving on this, weaponizing them and making every house person into a bomber, a suicide bomber almost. They're encouraging the population to become suicide bombers in the name of nationalism. So we don't know how long it will stay, but we can only hope that there's peace. And I think Russia is watching closely. They don't, I think they don't want a long war either. But currently they are quite stuck in this war, and so until they withdraw back to the eastern part, leave Kiev, I really wouldn't be able to tell. And lastly, I think I agree with Ambassador Bhadrakumar's position on India. I think India has this is the best option of neutrality, of sticking this ground. There has been a lot of critique, you know, that India should have taken a more normative position, but when there is no normative position, when the West wants to end multipolarity and have a unipolar world with US primacy, and change India structurally. Just yesterday I saw a statement, I think it was Victoria Nuland again, who said we have in this long term to convince India to change their arms suppliers. We have to supply this so-called 50% arms which Russia is supplying. So this is their long-term strategy. So India will have to not just, you know, watch out now, but in a very long and sustained way, that they don't get involved in this war and in future wars, in the new forever wars of the US. Thanks.
Right. Thanks to both of you for joining us for this very interesting and informative discussion. Several question marks remain, many imponderables still out there. So I think, like the world is watching, let's all hope for peace, that better sense dawns, and the countries involved now stop playing this kind of politics, which is risky, which has created so much suffering and bloodshed all across the world, and allows humanity to live in peace. Thank you.